Hello, everyone. This is Key here. We're going to actually start notes today, which is super exciting. So I wanted to show you before we get started the format of our notes for today. So roughly we're going to be using an outline format. Outline formats are pretty typical for note taking. You also may have seen something similar when you're planning your like a writing of an essay. But essentially, you use Roman numerals to represent the main points, and those are the large Roman numerals. Underneath a main point, you might have a sub point. And so that would be indented slightly more, and those would be using capital letters. And so maybe you have two subpoints for the first three main points, for example, and the first four, and then maybe this last subpoint, there's even subpoints underneath that, so a subpoint, and then that would be numbered, and then another category of that would be lowercase letters. So it goes large Roman, capital Roman numeral, capital letters, numbers, lowercase letters. And then you might even keep going with smaller Roman numerals, lowercase Roman numerals. So it can kind of keep going with however many subpoints you want. If you're going to have a subpoint, though, make sure you have at least two or more. Otherwise, it can kind of make the format seem a bit strange or off. Okay, so that's the format for today. And it's always good to be practicing note-taking skills. So that's one of the great things about this class is that we're going to be embedding that concept. So far in your notebook, you have your introduction page, which you should have signed, and you have the first two table of contents page. On the left side here, you should have already had pages 1 through 4 in your table of contents. So today you are going to be writing notes, scientific method for page 5, and free choice output for page 6. So go ahead, pause the video if you need to, and write that down in your table of contents. Once you have that written, you can flip with me all the way. So your free choice menu and examples should be in there. I did my little doodle page that we talked about the last class about things that make me think of science. And then here is the cover page for the scientific method. One thing you might want to note that the test date is going to be October 1st for people who have classes on Mondays and Thursdays, and October 2nd for those who have classes with me or Mr. Howard on Tuesdays and Fridays. So you might want to write the test date here. You may also want to note it in your planner for future reference. Then we need to add titles to these two pages. So whatever we write in our table of contents, we're going to write that or something very similar at the top so that you can find what you need. So at the top of page 5, the title is the scientific method. So you can go ahead and write that at the top of your paper. And on the right side, free choice output. You'll notice that this is me assuming that you only need one page to write your notes. So that means you're going to have to gauge the length of your page. You're going to have to kind of look at it and plan out your writing and make sure you're not writing too big on the notes page, just so that it only stays on one page. That's really important. So we're going to start on page 5. Hopefully in your science classes, you went through that silly plant science experiment activity PowerPoint. So you already have a general idea. Plus, I know you've done science fair, so scientific method should be somewhat familiar to you. But we're going to go over it. We're going to make sure it's in your notebook to reference and to study from in preparation for any future quizzes or tests. So I'm using pencil. I think pencil's great because it erases, and erasing is wonderful because it assumes I'm going to make a mistake, and I am, and then I can erase it and fix it. So like I said, we're going to use Roman numerals to start off our outline. There's going to be 5 main points. The 5 main points are going to be the steps of the scientific method that I want you to understand for this class. So we're going to call this step 1. And I'm going to use a colon. And the first step, which you may recall from the PowerPoint, is the question. So the question is exactly as it sounds. It literally asks the question that you're trying to solve for your scientific experiment. So I'm not going to make this a fancy definition. Anytime I'm going too fast, feel free to pause as needed. Write your notes and get caught up. So that's our main bullet. So we've got this first step, question, ask the question you're trying to solve. There's a particular format, so that's a sub-bullet. So I'm going to use the letter A, capital A, as the first sub-bullet. So the format is pretty standard for most scientists. The format is going to be will or does or some kind of question word. Will blank, and usually this blank is going to be the independent variable. We'll talk more about that later. I'm going to use abbreviations. Abbreviations are super helpful when note taking. If you feel like you may not remember what this stands for, you might make a little key up at the top that says independent variable equals, and then you can say what you've abbreviated for. I know I use IV and DV a lot as well to abbreviate. So will blank independent variable goes there. Impact or effect is also sometimes used. The blank. And that, you guessed it, is the dependent variable. And of course it's a question, so I'm going to have to put a question mark. Will the independent variable impact the dependent variable? So my sub-bullet 2 is going to be an example. I'm going to use the example from the slideshow that you went over about the magic seeds. So the question was, will, and the independent variable in that case was an energy drink. And the independent variable is just what is going to be changing. What am I manipulating? Will an energy drink impact the rate or speed or growth of a plant? So I'm going to put the rate a plant grows. And that's the dependent variable. The dependent variable is what we're measuring. So independent variable, dependent variable, that's how we're measuring the effect of our independent variable. Okay, so that is the step 1 for the scientific method. You just come up with the question. Usually this starts by you just wondering something. You're curious and it sort of organically happens. We make it a little more official in science, obviously. We have a format and we call things fancy words like independent, dependent variables, but you do this every day. You just don't realize it. Or maybe you do. So the second bullet, second main point, so I'm going to use my Roman numeral again. Step 2 is typically at this point, you are ready to form a hypothesis. However, you're going to probably need to do some research first. So I don't count that as a separate step because it confuses people. Your hypothesis, you can't even form it accurately until you've done research. Your research gives you the context that you need to be able to make a good hypothesis. So hypothesis is step 2, and that is going to be an educated guess based on, and you've probably already guessed it, research. That research might be reading something, looking up reliable resources, using the internet, using books. It also could be you might already have some prior knowledge on a topic and you can create a hypothesis based on that. We'll be doing a lot of prior knowledge hypothesis in class, but for the science fair, obviously you would want that to be research based for sure. Okay, an educated guess based on research. Our first sub-bullet here is going to be the format. So the format for a hypothesis is an if-then statement. You've probably heard that before, but I'm going to add a third component that you may or may not have heard. So if blank, so this is usually the independent variable, if IV, then, not than, because we're talking about order here. If this, then blank, the DV. Because, and that's, I can, hang on. Told you I'd make a mistake. Because, and that's where you would fill in your research-based reason for why you think a certain result will happen. Well, my bullet point B is going to be an example of a hypothesis. So an example, we'll do if I increase the concentration of energy drink. And concentration just means there's more energy drink than there is water in the liquid that you're using to water it. If I increase the concentration of energy drink, then the plant will grow faster because, and I'm not going to write the research, but let's say our guess is something to do with, there's a special growth enhancing chemical that's in energy drinks that we want to see if it works for plants. So I don't think that's true, but I'm just guessing based on our hypothetical situation from the other day. So our third bullet is, and don't worry, if you're halfway through the page, it's okay. The remaining bullets go much, much faster. So once we have a question, we've done our research and we've made our research-based hypothesis, then we are ready for step 3. Step 3 is when we're like, okay, let's test it. And in the science world, rather than saying testing it, we're normally going to use the word experiment because experimental design is crucial, and how you structure your experimental design is going to determine whether or not you're successful. So the experiment, that's the doing part. Retest your IB, your independent variable, and you collect your data. Take that off. So actually, you know what? I don't want to use a sub-bullet. We're going to talk about experimental design in great detail later on. But essentially, you want to collect data here. You want to make sure you have constants and controls. A control is the variable that you're going to be comparing your results to. Constants are anything that you want to keep the same to ensure the fidelity and reliability, validity of your data. So good experimental design is the toughest part about science. So we'll cover that a lot. So I'm going to do the fourth one. The Roman numeral IV is 4. So that's step 4. And that is going to be the analysis. So you've collected your data and now you are ready to look at it and say whether or not actually, you're not even making a decision yet. You're simply taking the time to look at your data and evaluate it and really let it process, which actually takes a really long time. So this is looking at your data. And you're going to use that to create. So you're going to be creating charts and graphs based on your data. This analysis portion is pretty tough. And this is essential because if you don't analyze your data correctly or you create a chart or graph incorrectly, you might get the wrong conclusion. So if you don't do this step right, conclusion is not going to go so well. So the fifth and final step, step 5, you guessed it, conclusion. And that's going to be you making a decision about what you learned. And you decide here whether or not you made the correct hypothesis. And you talk about that, and you're going to use data to support. Usually a conclusion is some sort of written paragraph or more to decide whether or not you, or to prove whether or not you found the correct conclusion, made the correct conclusion. Okay, so if you have space at the bottom, we're going to write out a mnemonic that was in the slideshow from the other day. A mnemonic is just any sentence or phrase that you use to help you remember the order of something. It's specifically for the order. So we know we had, if you ran out of room here, you can sort of write it along the edge or at the top. But remember, you really need to make sure you're sticking to one page of notes. So do not go to the next page. So for steps, you had question, which starts with a Q, hypothesis, which starts with an H, research-based hypothesis, experiment, analyze your data, your analysis, and you create a conclusion. So I have already come up with a mnemonic that I shared with you the last class, but I'll write it here. And if you would like to come up with your own, you can put one to the side as well. So the one I did was quotes, help, elephants, and chickens. So it's a sentence, it's a weird sentence, but it's a sentence. And it's just to help me remember this order, QHEAC. I think you probably know it, but just in case it helps. So again, if you would like, you can make your own mnemonic right here. So those are your first set of notes. I know it was a lot of writing, but I think that it's good to practice this, especially as we look to sending you off to high school. It's really just good practice. So reach out if you have any questions, and we'll keep elaborating on this and go into greater detail next class. Stay tuned for the second video, which is going to be about your output assignment that goes along with these notes.